Hi folks, Caroline Mitchell here. I'm an ex-police detective and crime thriller author. Just who was Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper? Over the course of 4 years, he murdered 13 women, causing the police to launch the biggest criminal investigation in British history. This is a very famous case, but given his recent death, it's as good a time as any to cover it. And stick around, because I'll be discussing some things that you might not know about the Yorkshire Ripper. Between 1975 and 1980, the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper brutally murdered 13 women and attacked many more. So who was Peter Sutcliffe? Well, he was born in Bingley in Yorkshire to John and Kathleen Sutcliffe in 1946. His father, John, who was then aged 23, had been demobbed from the Merchant Navy and he worked in a bakery. His 25-year-old mother, Kathleen, was employed in a munitions factory, and Peter had 5 other siblings. He was said to be a delicate child, and his mum, who lost her second son prematurely, was said to have fussed over him all the time. He had weak ankles and was slow in learning to walk, and he would literally cling to his mother for support. He didn't like playing outside like other kids, preferring to stay in and read books. Until the age of 18, he was an altar boy at the Roman Catholic church he and his mum attended. And this was said to disappoint his father, who dismissed him as being weedy, and he told off his wife for mollycoddling him. Years later, Peter's dad would blame his mother for overindulging him and helping to turn him into a mass murderer. Although the Sutcliffe parents appeared religious, Peter's siblings were allowed to sleep with their boyfriends and girlfriends in the house from an early age, and his sister became pregnant when she was quite young. His father was said to be notorious for groping the young girls that their sons brought home. But he was a hard man, and his sons were too scared of him to say anything. Sutcliffe's mother embarked on an affair with a police sergeant, it said. His father was a cruel and violent man, so when he found out about his wife's betrayal, he humiliated her by bringing their children to the local hotel where she was meant to meet her lover, in a room that she believed he had booked. But when Kathleen opened the door, she found her family waiting for her. Sutcliffe's father called her a prostitute and made her take out the lingerie from her bag to show what she was going to wear that evening to her children. Peter was said to have been devastated by this. At the age of 15, Sutcliffe had left school, and as a teenager he was into voyeurism, spending time spying on prostitutes at work. He struggled to mix with people socially, only comfortable when talking about cars and motorbikes. He took up weightlifting, but was too shy to date girls until much later. He worked in a string of low-paid jobs, including spending time as a gravedigger in the 1960s. But he had a strange habit of taking trophies from the bodies he buried and spoke about necrophilia with his co-workers. He once even threw a rock at a corpse in an open casket, laughing as he said it would wake him up. And later he came to say that as he was in the graveyard's Roman Catholic sector, that he first heard the voice of God. He said he couldn't make out the words, but the voice came from the top of a Polish gravestone. It had a terrific impact on me, he later said. I felt as though I had experienced something fantastic. I felt like I'd been selected. He was 21 at the time. He said he heard the voice hundreds of times afterwards, and first it was like calm and benign and reassuring, and then 2 years would pass before the voices sent him on a mission to kill prostitutes. When he was 20, he had his first relationship when he went out on a date with his future wife Sonia on Valentine's Day, and she was just 15 years old, and they married 7 years later. But after several miscarriages and upon medical advice, the couple stopped trying for children. He was said to be devastated when he discovered that his wife was having an affair with an ice cream man as she was completing a teacher training course. And after she began acting oddly, stripping off at inappropriate times, hearing voices and suffering with delusions that she was the second Christ. She was later diagnosed and treated for schizophrenia. Sutcliffe was also later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which is believed to have played a role. And I want to stress that having an illness like schizophrenia doesn't make you a bad person. There are loads of perfectly functioning people who manage it all their lives under the correct treatment. But as for Sutcliffe, he struggled to hold down a full-time job, and he had been caught stealing in the past. And it wasn't until he got a job as a HGV driver for a holdings company in Bradford in 1976 that he eventually held down a steady job. He spent hours polishing his lorry, and according to his co-workers, he frowned at the topless pin-ups that decorated other drivers' cabs. He was considered a model employee. He hosted regular Sunday lunches for his parents and 5 siblings. At the same time, he was visiting the red light district for prostitutes, and in 1969 he was driving around on the hunt for a prostitute who he believed had conned him out of money and later humiliated him in a pub in front of everyone. But he instead attacked an unknown street worker, hitting her over the head with a stone in a sock. But the victim managed to escape, and she didn't take it any further. In July 1975, he attacked his second victim, if I'm trying to pronounce this, Anna Rogulski, who later survived. Anna was knocked unconscious with a hammer and had her stomach slashed with a knife while she was walking by. Sutcliffe's attack was disturbed by a neighbour, but Anna was left severely traumatised. And in the same year, he attacked Olive Smelt in Halifax, who also survived. Again, he hit her from behind, using a knife to slash her above the buttocks. Like his previous attack, he was interrupted, and he left his victim badly injured but alive. Her emotional scars included clinical depression, which would haunt her later on. His youngest victim was 14-year-old Tracy Brown, which he attacked from behind, hitting her over the head 5 times as she walked down a country lane near her home. She survived but needed brain surgery, and she later said that as he hit her, it was with such force that each blow was accompanied by a brutal grunting noise. He wasn't convicted of the attack at the time, but he confessed to it much later in 1992. But he was building up to murder, and eventually killed 28-year-old Wilma McCann. Mother of 4 Wilma lived in Scott Hall, a district of Leeds, which was next to the red light area of Chapeltown. Heading home the worse for wear one night after having a few drinks, she was picked up by this punter who took her to a patch of waste ground. He hit her over the head with a hammer and stabbed her repeatedly. It was a brutal and vicious attack, and Wilma's daughter suffered with crippling depression for years later and ended up taking her own life. Sutcliffe continued in the same vein, which earned him the nickname of the Yorkshire Ripper. But, there was 2 sides to him. He was popular with his neighbours and was said to do them favours, and he'd have his friends round for dinner. Every Christmas he'd visit an old people's home to hand out gifts. But inside he harboured a furious hatred for women, so twisted that even after he killed them, he would continue to mutilate their bodies, hence the nickname the Yorkshire Ripper. 11 weeks after murdering Wilma, he murdered Emily Jackson, who had been working as a prostitute out of a van. And we have to remember that these were very hard times. There was low employment and a lot of poverty, and for some women it was the only way of scraping enough money together to feed their children. How desperate they must have been, putting themselves out there, knowing that there was a killer on the loose. Sutcliffe then stabbed her 51 times with a screwdriver. He stamped on her thigh so hard that he left an impression from his boot. Over the next 6 years, he terrorised Yorkshire, but the case didn't attract worldwide attention until he murdered Jane MacDonald, a 16-year-old schoolgirl who was walking home after a night out. The media reacted with horror, labelling her as an innocent victim. And we'll talk about that label a little later on. His hunting grounds were so widespread that he became the most feared murderer of the time. He left the bodies half naked and posed in such a disrespectful manner that the police were left in no doubt that they were dealing with an evil sexual sadist. And there have been many books and documentaries about his crime, but it's said that you had to live in the north of England during the 1970s and early 80s to fully understand the terror that he instilled on the community. As body after body was discovered, first in Leeds, then Bradford, then Huddersfield, Halifax and Manchester, women were terrified to go out. Schools offered self-defence classes for female pupils. Feminist groups went on Catch the Ripper marches and protested at cinemas that were showing films considered to incite violence towards women. Pepper sprays were carried and sharpened nail files were hidden in handbags. Pubs and discos were deserted. Thousands and thousands of police officers and specialists were involved in the investigation. Sutcliffe was interviewed 9 times by police during the investigation but never charged. In 1977 he killed Jean Jordan, but after that murder he realised that he'd given her a £5 note for her services. He returned to where he hid the body beneath some bushes but couldn't find the £5 note, which was hidden away in her handbag. Furious, he attacked her body a second time while she was dead, and the police later found the fiver hidden in a section of her bag and seized it as evidence. The £5 note was traced back to a bank, and 5,000 men, including Sutcliffe, were interviewed over the course of 3 months after police worked out 8,000 employees who could have received the note in their wage packets.
Sutcliffe's last victim was a 19-year-old student at Leeds University, Jacqueline Hill. Her death led to the setting up of a new super squad of top detectives, desperate to catch a man who seemed to defy every known detection technique. In fact, Sutcliffe had been amazingly lucky. Perhaps the strongest clue he left behind was the new £5 note he'd given to a prostitute he'd killed in Manchester. The number was traced to an engineering firm he worked for in Bradford, and he was interviewed there 6 times by the police.
They thought they'd got him. I mean, one lad said to me, he said, well, you know, we think this is him, and took him away. Peter came back about 5 o'clock, and because we asked him what happened, they said that they'd interviewed him further, questioning him his whereabouts and what he did, and they took some of his clothes away for forensic tests, and they gave him a saliva test as well. It used to be a joke that he was nicknamed the Ripper, and he used to answer to that sometimes. So it was, it's rather sort of a bit sad now, isn't it?
Sutcliffe said he was at a family party, and police found his alibi to be credible. Then there was a spanner in the works, one which would change the course of the investigation. In 1978, police received a tape recording from a different man taunting them that he was the real Yorkshire Ripper. The suspect was nicknamed Wearside Jack due to his accent, and this changed the course of the whole investigation as officers went down a blind alley investigating the wrong man. Peter Sutcliffe's last murder took place on November 17, 1980, when he killed 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill. On January 2nd in 1981, a policeman spotted Sutcliffe with Olivia Rivers, a woman he had dealt with previously for prostitution. Little did the officer know that he was face to face with a Yorkshire Ripper. He arrested Sutcliffe after discovering false plates on his car, something which raises instant suspicion. Sutcliffe told the officer that he desperately needed to pee, and he was allowed to go behind a nearby storage tank. And while Sutcliffe was in custody, the officers were looking at him and looking at the description of the Ripper, and following a hunch, they returned to the scene of the arrest the next day, and they found where he had thrown a knife and a hammer behind the storage tank where he stopped for a pee.
By the end of the inquiry, the incident room in Leeds was crammed full of facts and information connected with the case, but none of it, sadly, led to Sutcliffe. 250,000 names were individually filed on cards. More than 30,000 statements were taken. The strain on manpower and resources was immense. Police from forces all over the north saturated the red light areas where prostitutes operated and sent in millions of car numbers for storage on computers. Sutcliffe's car alone was spotted 60 times. After 3 separate sightings, he was taken in for questioning. That meant he'd been interviewed 9 times by the police. But always he was either loosely alibied by his wife Sonia, or he had some equally plausible excuse. But perhaps the main reason he got away with it for so long was because the police leading the hunt put great emphasis on a tape recording they'd received.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
The tape, with its strong northeast accent, was, of course, as we now know, a hoax, and it sent everybody off looking for clues in quite the wrong direction.
They can't be much good, can they?
Sutcliffe's friend Trevor Birdsall, who'd long suspected that Sutcliffe might be the Ripper, says he discounted the idea just because his friend hadn't got a Geordie accent. In the end, Sutcliffe was caught quite by chance. He'd put false number plates on his car to go out once more looking for a prostitute to kill. When the plates were checked and the police finally found some of his weapons, he confessed.
After days and intense rounds of questioning from the police, Sutcliffe gave a 15-hour statement confessing to the murders. Blood evidence later confirmed that Sutcliffe was the Yorkshire Ripper. It came to light that Sutcliffe's wife gave him an alibi when he was previously questioned by the police. She confirmed that her husband rarely went out in the evening, and if he did, it was with her. In reality, he would vanish for hours at a time, but it said the naive and self-centred young wife was accepting of his excuses. When Sutcliffe was arrested, his only concern was his wife, Sonia. He pleaded with officers to let him break the news to her, and they agreed. She was taken to see him at Dewsbury Police Station, and he told her, "It's me, I am the Yorkshire Ripper." Sonia was said to be shocked into silence and then replied, "What on earth did you do that for, Peter? Even a sparrow has a right to live." At his trial, Sutcliffe claimed that he was guilty of manslaughter, not murder, because of diminished responsibility caused by mental health issues. He also pleaded guilty to 7 counts of attempted murder, and at the conclusion of his 2-week trial, he was found guilty of all charges and given 20 life sentences for his crimes. His wife remained loyal to him, though, for several years, visiting him and later writing to him in prison. She divorced him 13 years later after he was imprisoned, and even then, after she remarried, she continued contact. It's said that she knew nothing of his crimes. Sutcliffe was housed at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for the Criminally Insane, which housed some of England's toughest criminals. He spent about 30 years at Broadmoor Hospital before being transferred to an actual prison in 2016, just 4 years ago. He was not a popular prisoner, though, and was attacked relentlessly by his fellow inmates, and one managed to blind him in his left eye by stabbing him numerous times with a pen. He then became blind in his other eye after an injection which was supposed to clear the blurriness caused by his diabetes went wrong. He also used a wheelchair, it said, and required a jail buddy to help him get around the prison. So it said he later changed his surname from Sutcliffe to Coonan, his mother's maiden name, because he was scared about people vandalising his grave after he died. Prison sources said that he flew into a rage after learning of a planned ITV 6-part TV series. And the series, which was based on a book about the police investigation into Sutcliffe, was recently announced. In October this year, he was treated at University Hospital of North Durham after a suspected heart attack. And he was then tested positive for coronavirus after leaving the hospital, and it's said that he refused treatment for it. On Friday the 13th, it was reported that he died in hospital at 1:10 in the morning after his lungs collapsed, and it was said that he had a do not resuscitate on his chart. And do you remember Wearside Jack, the man who derailed the whole investigation by sending letters and tapes? In 2005, officials took DNA from one of the envelopes and sent it to law enforcement and submitted it to the national database. They belonged to alcoholic loner John Humble, who had been arrested and cautioned for being drunk and disorderly a few years earlier. And of course, that arrest and caution would have kept his details on the system, enabling them to help catch him for perverting the course of justice. It's said that Humble had tried to commit suicide by throwing himself off a bridge, only to land on a passing boat. Pleading guilty just before his trial in 2006, Humble was sentenced to 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice, and he served just 4. Recently, the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police apologised for the language and tone used to describe the Yorkshire Ripper victims by senior officers investigating the case at the time. And I'm so glad the Chief Constable acknowledged this and acknowledged the earlier handling of the case several decades ago was as wrong then as it is now. But retired Detective Roger Parnell, who worked on the Ripper inquiry, rejected accusations that officers did not care less about the victims who were prostitutes. He told BBC 5 Live, "I certainly did, and I can assure you that we did. These ladies were wives, they were mothers, they were sisters. We were all determined from the beginning to catch the perpetrator of all these murders." So if you'd like to hear more about the victims, I'll put some links below. And I have to pay tribute to the women who survived and found the strength to testify against Peter Sutcliffe in court, as well as all the families of the women who died. I really hope that they have found some peace now that Sutcliffe has passed away. There's no arguing that these are horrific crimes, but it is worth remembering that advantages in technology, DNA and forensic have come so far forward now, and this is why most prolific murderers were found back in the 70s. So don't let these crimes play too much on your mind. Thanks a million, guys, for tuning in, and if you'd like to see more, then watch my other videos and do subscribe and give me a little like. But until next time, take care of yourselves. Bye bye.